So ideally with something like this, where we started off with more questions than we were going to be able to answer, we would not add questions to the list, but since folks came up and asked questions, we now have more questions than we ended the previous session with, so we'll do our best. Pretty good multi-part question that got asked actually just in the break that I thought was pretty interesting, and I kind of wanted to hear what people had to say about it. Was oftentimes we in the game industry we will pull research from other places. So when you're working on something or implementing something, especially in graphics, but also in sort of other areas, we go get research from places that isn't necessarily game industry. So it could be SIGGRAPH was a common one back before games sort of did a lot of the original research that's in SIGGRAPH, like that sort of stuff. But even today, it's still very common. But then there's certainly obviously tons of stuff like AI, all these sorts of things. There's tons of publications, and oftentimes games pull from those. So the two-part question, and I'll say what both parts are, but we're gonna have to take them both separately. The first part is, these papers oftentimes, regardless of whether the thing they're talking about is going to be useful or not, are oftentimes they have a bit of a math wall in them, right? Or a nomenclature wall, where if you might be a very good programmer, but you're coming to this paper and you're looking at it and you're like, I do not know what I'm looking at here, right? And so the question is, how do you start getting past this barrier? Like, how do what do you need to do? How do you need to start practicing to be able to start reading these papers more fluently? And then the second part of the question was, assuming that you kind of have gotten to the point where you can start using papers effectively, how do you find and evaluate them? So just going back to the first part, to the math wall part, does anyone want to kind of start off on that one? I don't know. I can probably hazard an answer even to that one.
Mine's going to sound really stupid, but when I look at those and I see a symbol I don't recognize, I try to find it on Wikipedia and then figure out what the symbol is. And that's worked.
You just type in squiggly line?
Yeah, well, Google's really good at what is the math sign that is this is just an example, a weird half E kind of thing, and it'll come up with it. It'll show you a picture of it. So, and then, so Google.
But that's only going to get you
that only gets you a little bit.
Stuff.
Yes,
yeah. I mean, that's I didn't know that was a...
Well, I don't read a lot of papers either. So.
Anybody else?
Yeah. So my wife is a biostatistician, and so I actually get to read some of her papers, and I know that there's a huge math gap. She's way more advanced than me. So I do have a resource that helps me cheat. But I would say the first thing is, the density of papers tends to be very much higher than most of the reading you do on the internet. And so you're probably used to skimming, this is what I do, right? Most of the internet reading I'm doing is skimming, even for programming stuff, because it's okay, there's the meat. That's the line of code, or that's the core function that I need. When you read science papers, boy, you really have to just slow down a lot in your reading. And really, if you don't understand the terminology, you have to go and read something else, go to Google and get the terminology. And then it's much more likely you can actually use the results of those papers.
I could sense the beginning of a
I have a lot of thoughts about this, right? So about the math wall, I don't find that tends to happen to me in terms of notation, but it does happen in terms of concepts, right? Okay. Do you understand that I don't know, differential geometry has a certain set of results and what that implies and whatever, and if you do, you can follow a thing, and if you don't, but usually I don't try to follow things that much anyway. I'm very impatient when it comes to papers. Okay. I'm I don't care. I don't really care why this works right now. I just want to type the thing that works. And if that's promising, then I'll come back and build my understanding. In fact, that's even going way back. That's how I learned software texture mapping, right? Okay. Which by current day standards, that's actually very simple mathematics, right? But I would read Mike's articles and Chris's articles, and Mike's especially, right? I would read those several times. I still didn't really understand. I didn't know what the 1/z thing was for, and whatever, right? Because I didn't even at that time have experience with projection.
Right. Yeah.
All the experience with projection that you have now from decades of making games, I didn't even have. I literally sat down and wanted to make games and didn't know any of that. So, but I just kind of started trying to understand a little bit of it, right? Okay, I'm just going to get a triangle on the screen with no texture. And then by the time I've done that, I actually have more context. So the thing, actually this applies to my approach to everything, is just, I'm willing to let myself just be pretty dumb for a while and not care, because human brains are really good at pattern matching and learning and improving. And it doesn't need so much for you to consciously try that hard, right? If you immerse yourself in something for a while, you'll just kind of get it. And then you come back and, if you really need to read it again later and understand it, you know, it's not like you're going to automatically understand it, but you're in a more privileged position the second time around, right?
Yeah.
But my second thing to say is I've been burned so many times by papers that I think most of them, I don't go to papers as a, like if I see a paper that claims some result, like, oh, this algorithm does something fast, or I don't believe it. My default stance, is that this is not even toilet paper, right? Like, because I've so many times I've put in the effort to do something, and then it turns out, well, okay, it may be 10%, but they haven't done the real work, right?
Yeah.
And that I'm maybe a little bit I've overcorrected in that direction, and
Right.
I'm more cynical than I should be.
Okay.
But really, most papers are not very good. But some of them are tremendously good, right? Some of them will change your understanding in such a way that you are just on a different level now in terms of being able to approach a certain class of problem. And so
Yes.
it's very important to like keep an eye on stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you know which is the right stuff a
Yeah.
priori.
I mean, sometimes I guess you can kind of get that from the word of mouth on a particular paper, and then, you know, people I trust have been finding this to be useful, but, you know, even that you don't really know. Sometimes people get really excited about something that's really actually not that exciting, and so even that's kind of something where it's hard to tell, I suppose. I was going to say something about the math wall, sort of separate from that, that's very much related to what Pat said, which is just, I think that most of the time, if I'm looking at a paper and I don't really know what's actually going on in the paper, like, because obviously you kind of read the abstract and the textual part, and you're kind of like, okay, well, obviously anyone who reads this is going to kind of vaguely know what's going on in the paper. Like, some papers are maybe so sort of far afield that you wouldn't even have any idea what they're even talking about. But most of the time, especially when you're talking about something you might be reading for, you know, graphics, for example, is at least a picture. So you're not completely out to lunch. So, you know, typically the math wall part usually comes in when they start doing things. It's like, oh, okay, you know, here are some equation lines that aren't really quite worked through all the way, and then they say some stuff, and then there's another one here, and they don't really quite relate exactly the way that you might be obvious, and blah, blah, blah. So you're kind of starting to go like, wait, what's going on? And I find that when I actually do need to understand those, pretty much I just have to redo the math myself on a separate piece of paper, always. So either the math was so obvious when I looked at it that it was like, you know, high school algebra and anyone could read it, or it's pretty much I have to work it out. It's rare that I actually can read it, just read it. And so I feel like the slowing down part is like really important. It's just like, okay, if I want to understand this, I'm just going to take my time. I'm going to like start writing out the equations, try to work them through myself, maybe get confused about how they got something and work it through. And then I usually find when I've actually finally made the mental decision that I'm actually going to take the time to understand it, then I can, right? Whereas before that, it was just kind of like I'm just moving around my eyes around the page, hoping that for some reason I eventually start knowing what the math did, which never works, right? Or certainly hasn't previously. So let's move on to the second part of that question, which I think is you kind of just brought up, which is like, okay, so how do you find research, and how do you know if that research is good? So, maybe you're working on some kind of a problem, and you think that this problem is probably something that people have studied. It's probably not totally new. What's the process look like? Does anyone have any kind of experience stuff from that where they'd be like, here's how here's an example of how I might look for research on something, just even if it tends to be kind of a crappy solution, like, what does that look like? Dead silence.
I mean, web search will get you a little of the way. So for the witness, this didn't end up in the shipping game, but when we were initially building the island for the game, we didn't even know if it was going to be, a parameterized surface, right? Or if it was going to be hand constructed. We ended up with hand constructed in a modeler, but for the first few years of the game, it was like move some control points around, and we interpolate the surface. And I had some requirements on that meant that it couldn't be like the standard spline sheet thing that you would think of. It had to be a different thing. And I just searched for terms like interpolation of unstructured control points or something.
Okay.
And usually you don't really find the right thing that way, but if you spend like literally a day doing that, like of 8 hours of trying, you will probably find something if it exists, usually.
So it's kind of like a little bit of Google bingo. Like, how might I describe this in a way that I could see a paper talking about it?
Yeah, and then sometimes you'll find things that aren't the right thing, but they might refer, like you start learning about the subject space of like, okay, this is not what I want, but it's in some field and I'm seeing the field a little bit better, which might teach me more about the keywords to look for, right?
Right, yes.
Yeah, so that worked in that instance. That was good.
Nothing else? Wow.
I think some of it is the conclusions the paper draws, like,
Okay.
and look, if you run this code, then we can simulate thousands of objects on a computer.
That's sort of the evaluation part, right? Like once you've already found it, it's like when you look at that table of timings that they're proud of, and you're like, oh, right, because the maximum number is like way below what you could actually use in a game. So you're like, well, okay. So I have an answer to this one then, which is that I actually typically do it almost exactly the same way every time, which maybe is good, maybe is bad. So what I typically do is I first go through the publications that I know of that correspond to this thing. So for SIGGRAPH, I usually will manually step through like SIGGRAPH in reverse chronological order, right? And go in that bucket, because I don't know if you've ever seen how SIGGRAPH proceedings are laid out, they like bucket them by group. And I'm like, for the group that I care about here, what are the 5 papers that are in that group? And I just look to see if the sort of thing that I'm interested in has had anything in the SIGGRAPH recently. Because typically I find that's a really good way to kind of like jump up to date on something that I may have let slide because, I don't do that much graphics programming anymore, so I'm not like really in the know about what's going on there. So that's usually a good way to catch a few things. The next thing I'll typically do is take whatever those were that I found and just resource crawl them. I reference crawl them. So in the, the thing where it's like the bibliography, I'll just go like, okay, let's just grab all of what those papers are and also by professor. So if I get any kind of pull from that at all, I'll look at who the professor was that's on that paper or any co-authors that are on that paper. Because it's professor, they're oftentimes students, I suppose, who are writing the paper, but whoever is writing the paper. Because they usually have websites, and those websites are usually categorized by sort of what they've been working on recently, and they'll typically be like, oh, here's some things, and oh, that paper was actually the lead up to the thesis that I wrote, and I'm like, bingo, like I've got the thesis now, and so on. And so I find that if I actually kind of do this manual spider process, if I can just get one good pull, I can get the whole like net's worth of dolphin/tuna in that in that process, if that makes sense. So I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who finds that useful, but that's been typically my go-to for a long time. The only time that it becomes really hard is if you can't find any place to get an initial pull. So like if you're in a thing where you're like, I literally have no idea if there even is a publication somewhere that even talks about this thing at all. Or if it did, it's the kind of thing that's almost impenetrable to search. So it's like they don't have online indexes or anything, so I can't even get it. But most of the time,
I think in reality that's very rare, though.
I feel like it, especially these days.
But that's actually not the hard problem. The hard problem is again, the I don't know what I don't know problem, right?
Yes.
So like going back to the earlier days, right? Like Ken Shoemake had his famous quaternion paper that was like, here's how you could rotate 3D objects,
Right.
which was a very important paper because
Yeah.
prior to that, everybody was doing like janky Euler ankle stuff.
Yeah.
Not even game people, but like computer
Yes,
graphics
everybody,
people
yes.
didn't know how to rotate objects
Right.
correctly, right? And that was not a new research paper.
Right.
That was like, no, the guys who do spaceships like know how to do this, and
Yeah.
I'm going to communicate it to a different
Audience,
community,
yeah.
right? And so the fact that that exists, like how many of those papers have not been written because somebody didn't
Yes.
have the idea that this other community might be interested in this thing? It's got to be, like, of relevancy to games, it's got to be hundreds, right?
Well, and probably there's a two-stage process there to a certain degree as well, which is that like the only reason that paper was able to be written is because somebody in the spaceship field had read math stuff on quaternions, because otherwise they wouldn't have known to apply quaternion math to astrophysics anyway, right? So you kind of have that sort of thing probably just in general. Although I suppose since quaternions kind of came from physics in the first place, that's probably kind of a
No,
bad.
I mean, it was Hamilton, right?
Yeah, but he was trying to describe rotations in 3D space, so it wasn't
Yeah,
it
yeah.
wasn't like this thing that we didn't really think about and then it came down. But let's imagine other mathematical concepts which were not created to do anything that had anything to do with computer stuff. Pulling those in the first place takes one step of somebody going, oh, hey, this thing that I happened to do when I was working on some abstract math stuff, I think I could use that here for a practical problem. And then there's the what other practical problems could it actually apply to? And that's like a second step that neither of which may happen, in which case you're kind of just sitting there going, we'll never know.
Yeah, we're still waiting for your paper, by the way, on using Taylor series expansion for estimating the division coordinate for quaternions. Because we stole that, you told us about that idea for Guild Wars in 2004 or something like that, and we're like, that's a great idea.
Okay, I remember this incident, but I never used the Taylor series expansion for it.
Oh, it was a different expansion then. It was an estimation of the lower term, of the division term.
So I think what that was is just that it's actually a trick I want to say that I saw from maybe Carmack or something that was not for quaternions at all. But it's basically just like if you want to renormalize something, so you have something that you're going to take that was normal before and you do something and you want to renormalize it, right? It's just a really simple first order approximation of how to renormalize something. If you know that its original length was close to 1, you could get it back there. So I'm pretty sure I don't need to write a paper.
Well,
I can just point at the original.
That's like the kind of instruction that shipped in 3D now and whatever. Originally,
Yes,
right?
sort
like
of.
the fast inverse.
Sort of.
Whatever. Yeah.
And so I think I might be able to magically point to that paper without actually having to do it. Because I stole that. That I totally stole. I just put it on quaternions because it was on just regular vectors before.
Yeah. Just to give you an idea, so I spent roughly, I'd written the animation system for Guild Wars and spent about a month trying to optimize quaternions to use less CPU. And so approximating like a 1 over square root of sine or something like that. I can't remember the exact term.
It's in Slurp.
Yeah, and it's nasty. And so I did all these approximations and I ended up with these weird 3D models that would animate a bunch of points that are obviously supposed to look like a character, look like a mess. And you came along with your solution and it just magically worked. So look for his tweet stream to point this out.
All right, I'll put it up there, but I know I stole that. I know I stole that from, because people had to renormalize, vectors all the time, just standard 3-dimensional vectors. And since quaternions are basically just the same, you could just apply it. So I think we probably even had been using that in the character animation system, probably just for regular vectors. And I was like, I'll just 4 elements, just as easy or something like that.
I just wanted to say I have no idea what you guys are talking about.
It's what lets the hand go on the doorknob.
So if it hadn't have been over a decade since this happened, I could probably rederive it, but I'm pretty sure I won't remember how to do it, is the problem. It's basically, I'll ask a question and see if I can do it on a notebook, and then I can show it. It's really simple. But I just, since I wasn't the person who figured it out originally, too, it's more of a thing that I just remember someone telling me how to do, whereas, if you actually work something out yourself, oftentimes it kind of sticks a little bit better, at least for me. All right, so let's ask the last part of that question, just in case there's anything we didn't actually cover, which is for a SIGGRAPH paper or for any kind of math paper that's in this in that range. How do you evaluate one to know if it's good? And it sounds like your answer is it's not. So you don't need to evaluate it. It's just not.
No, I mean there's a small probability that there's some curve, but it's very steep, where the really good papers are clustered at the end, but most of them are like something a guy wrote because he had to publish a bunch of things.
Okay.
And it's really it varies by discipline, but in computer science it's pretty bad.
Okay.
It's not a good situation.
The ratio is not favorable.
Good. Yeah.
I guess you were saying one way is to look at just the conclusion, right? You're just looking at kind of like when they showed the results. What does that section look like, I guess, basically? Like how much confidence do you place in, if it doesn't have any results listed at all? I'm assuming the answer is just don't.
Yeah, usually I read the abstract to find that I'm in the right paper, and then I read the conclusion to see what the results were, and then see if that warrants reading the rest of the paper.
So it's like the middle gets paged in if the two ends look good, basically.
There's also like some authors are reliable. So like if
Okay.
Kahan is on a paper,
Okay.
it's probably a good paper.
Okay.
right? It's just that most people are not Kahan or whoever.
Okay.
Right? So that's the problem.
Well, so basically going by author is one way as well, potentially.
Yeah, but
I mean,
then you're not going to hit most
things,
fields
yeah,
or
that's
subject
true.
matters, right? Yeah.
All right, so let's go off of that. Topic was surprisingly silent. I guess that kind of means maybe we don't use research as much as we think we do. I don't know. I feel like I use it. Maybe not.
We
as
used to
often
more in the
than we
in the
do
older
now.
days. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like back when, like now it's most of our bottlenecks are just getting everything done. Which like if I could read a paper that
Complexity.
helps with that, that would be great. But it's not like I have a lot of, I don't perceive technology barriers between me and what I'm trying to do these days. Well, programming
Yeah.
language kind of things and whatever, but.
So, all right, let me pick another one here. So this one kind of applies to what we talked about yesterday, and it's kind of an interesting question because I feel like it gets brought up a lot. It got brought up at HandmadeCon 2015 as well, and it comes from Apuvra from India, who actually also makes the Papaya image editor, which I think is on Handmade Network. Actually, it's like an open source image editor. When creating an engine or shipping a game, what do you look for in a file format for asset data? How do you balance compression versus speed versus readability, et cetera? And sort of like separate from that, is there a particular best file format you've worked with in some case where you're like, this kind of does things right, more often than it does wrong? Thoughts on that?
I always get bit by the Indian byte order stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I always do. So I try to avoid that stuff.
So you have
as
only one
much
byte values?
Yeah, just 0 to 255, and I think
It's everything.
No, it's one of those things. I think I don't have to worry a whole lot about storage and load speed, but I have really gravitated towards file formats that are ASCII at some level.
Okay.
That aren't a lot of binary stuff. And I mean, clearly that does not work in a lot of games. For what I do, I just kind of enjoy that because it can also just pull up the file in a text editor and go,
see
what the
what it
hell
looks
is
like.
going on here? Yeah. So I've kind of gravitated towards kind of a very dense version of ASCII file formats for a lot of stuff I do.
So if you take, for example, you were talking about building a tool that allows you to lay out a room in Thimbleweed Park, that's typically going to save out to some kind of an ASCII file, which generally people aren't going to edit, I guess, but it is actually an ASCII description of it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are using a big GUI tool, and there is a point where just going into an editor and just going copy and then paste 50 times is just a lot faster than going through a GUI tool, and I kind of like that kind of backdoor into that data, so I tend to favor ASCII stuff.
I have actually kind of an interesting one. So again, this is the model exporter for Guild Wars. So we're using 3ds Max as our animation and model editing tool. And 3ds Max is notoriously difficult to get data out of because you can't read its file format. It's not documented. And so I wrote a plugin that would like live inside it, and you'd press a button and it would like go and ask all the APIs like, here, let me give vertex data and pull all that stuff together. And what I would do is I'd write a really simple file format. It was a chunked file format, but like the data was more or less exactly as it came from Max with no processing. And then I would run a second pass, and then I'd like convert it into model format data that was had to be super tightly packed because Guild Wars was like really early in the online game space, and we needed to download the whole game and every single file. So make them small and tight. And what that enabled me to do was then in the build process, like I go, I have a better way to compress the animation data. And so instead of having to like, take this data which was like hideously compressed and then reverse it, which is potentially lossy, I could actually go back to the source data and reprocess it and get a new compressed chunk out of that. So that worked really well.
And that was so that you wouldn't basically have to have something that loaded Max back up and reran the like export process or something kind
That's
of
right.
slow like that, which could be really brutal. I
Yeah,
suppose,
whereas like a
launch time is not great.
Yeah, Gaspard Games did this trick. I forget who the engineer was who showed it to me, but they had the system where they would automate 3ds Max, and they'd say like, okay, just Max, load up this file, reprocess it, and write the results, and they would just run for hours and hours and hours as they changed their model file formats.
Yeah.
And so that's like a different take on the problem of like recompressing your data a different way.
It also seems like it would keep you out of the business of, oh, like Max got upgraded and can't read this old file format correctly, so then now there has to be artist intervention for this process for some reason, and it's like we can just avoid that because as long as we saved the original export, we can always sort of re-mush the data without having to actually go back through the whole tool pipeline or something like this.
Exactly.
Tommy?
Yeah, I mean, I use ASCII stuff for like config files, but for me, stuff like when I integrated Flash and when I integrated Spine, or is it Spline? I don't remember. It's the one that everybody uses, but they didn't have a non-ASCII format. They just had JSON files, which is really irritating because I want to be able to just load in a big chunk of data and just do stuff with it, like what I do with the SWF file format. I just chunk, done. And what I save out for levels is the same. It's just a chunked file format of just as small as I can possibly get it for levels or anything. So.
And the difference there with JSON is that you're saying you don't want to have to start parsing things during the running of the game, or.
Yeah, well, yeah, I had to write a JSON parser, which was fun, but I didn't want to have to do that.
Right.
I wanted to just load in a thing and just have all my things, but yeah.
So to speak.
So to speak, yeah. So for me, it's more about it's more about just what is documented and what I can use. And then like with Spine, they had their two formats, and I was forced to use this one because they didn't have documentation for the other one. So they wanted me to use their library to do all that stuff, and I'm like, no. So yeah. Yeah, for me, it really doesn't matter.
Okay.
Well, I think what Pat said is sort of the direction that most larger games have gravitated toward. And I think it reveals a little bit of an assumption in the question, which is that there's a file format, right?
Okay.
I think what there really is there's things that you need to happen at various stages, right? Either like when the release game is going to load something, that needs to have certain characteristics, right?
Right.
Our tool pipeline needs different characteristics. And so you might have two different file formats, again, for example, for the mesh, at both of those stages, right? And then that lets you not just make different decisions about, automatically reprocessing to regenerate that second format, but now that second format can be different on different platforms, right? Because what is a mesh, right? Like a visual mesh has different precision requirements than a collision mesh.
Right.
And if you're tight on memory, you might use half floats for one or the other or whatever, right? And that happens all over the place. So even, something like entities, right? We have two different formats for entities. They're the same.
We meaning in the witness?
Yeah, in the witness, right? There's not everybody, right? But
everyone in the world
game
has
developers,
different formats for entities.
No, and that was kind of driven by a little bit by a desire for readability. In fact, the original format was just text because it was expected to be a small amount of data. Of course, when you have 30 to 40,000 entities, it becomes more data, right? But really, you also want to start the game up real fast and load all those things and not, whatever, use memory on it as well or anything. But we also had the constraint that entities were one of the main things that goes into and out of source control. So if that's a binary file format, then you're in trouble there, right? Because the second you have a merge conflict, you have to throw one or the other version away. You can't merge at all, really, or it would be kind of crazy, right? So there are reasons to have a text format, and reasons to have a readable format, and reasons to have a binary format, and they're at different places in different times, and you just lay out that architecture and decide what level of complexity you're willing to adopt to get the performance that you want, and then you do that, right? So, I mean, I don't know, like I'm sure if Chris Butcher had done a survey of how many different file formats they have in the Bungie asset system, like that would have been a 2-hour talk at least, like right there, right? I assume, I don't actually know, but it's not that there's a way to store data, right? Mike Acton would say, right?
The algorithms on either side of the data determine what the data is, kind of a thing? Is that what
Well,
you mean?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I guess that's a little meta-acting, right? Because he's always about program to the data,
Yeah.
but when you can also determine the data that will make the best program, then you
Right.
do that, right? So, yeah.
So I don't know if that sounds like you're basically saying you don't really look for something specific in file formats so much as you say, look, I know what it needs to do on either side of it.
Well, it's,
So whatever I look for in it is just what are the things that make those parts work well, or is that not
yeah,
really?
yeah, and it's contextual. So if something is a small amount of data, we're more likely to be text only. So like the variables that you set to control, like gravity or whatever. We don't ever have ballistic things in the witness anymore,
No.
but there's still a gravity variable. Player friction or whatever, right?
Yeah.
That's like, there's probably 100 variables or something, and those are just in a text file, and
Okay.
we load that up and we do that. And there's no reason to do it another way. It's not a frickin' JSON file
Right.
Right.
or anything like that, because that stuff drives me bananas, because the promise of like, oh, we have this general file format and all the tools will make it amazing to work with, that's
Yeah.
never true, right? It's always easier to just go like search for the line that says player acceleration and change that to whatever. And then because it's our own format, we can do small things. So I don't know if you hinted us at this or somebody did, but like anytime that we have a floating point value, for example, in one of these files, we put the human readable value and then like semicolon and then the hex value, right? So that if it hasn't been edited, you load the hex value and you get exact reproducibility of your float value. It won't wander if you resave the file or whatever, right, through bit errors. But if you want to edit it, you just delete the hex value and just change the thing. And then it's human editable, right? So that's a weird hybrid thing that's a little bit of a machine format and a little bit of a human format. And we just decided on that as being the best thing for us at the time, right? So I like to keep the text formats very small and simple.
How do you know? I am almost certain I am not the person who hinted at that, by the way.
Someone did. It might have been Charles.
It could have been Charles. So
I feel like that's an odd world thing.
It could be. How do you know? Do you just assume that 1-bit errors are close enough? Because if you can't reproduce the original float from the ASCII, how do you know if it's been edited? You just assume if the error
dude,
is below.
it's way worse. If you printf in Windows,
Okay.
like you're not down to 1-bit error half the time, I don't think. They might have fixed that.
Right, so I guess what I'm saying is,
but-
how do you know that whether the user has, the reason that the hex and the float don't agree is because the user edited them, or because the precision is just off?
Actually, let me correct that.
Do you know what I'm
right?
saying?
Let me correct that. Even if it's a 1-bit error, right, that's 1 bit per load and resave. So if you
Right.
resave that like
Correct.
500 times, I don't know where that number's going to go, right?
But that's not usually how it works. Usually it'll get into its local max because it'll save the same.
Well, if it's a scalar, right? So now you've got a vector and it's normalized, or I don't even like. There's just it's not that simple, right? And I don't. Yeah.
Either
There's
way,
a lot of.
I was just curious. So
I sleep better at night when the hex number is there, and I can.
I totally get that. I just wanted to know when you actually implement this.
Well, the other
I'm
issue.
just sa-
The other
okay.
issue actually is if that number wanders, then it's going to generate spurious source control check-ins and diffs,
Right.
which is a whole different thing, which we wanted to minimize. We did a lot of tactics in our file formats, actually. So there's a little bit of a different topic, but like, okay, I've got entity data,
Yes.
and I've got all these different types that the fields could be. So there's float types, there's maybe vector types if you decide that's a higher level thing, there's string types, and there's like an array of the IDs of other things, because you want to know like, oh, this is a container, and here's what's in the container, or whatever, right? We made the choice to not put those in the file format because it would generate diffs and conflicts. Like, we don't necessarily care what order things are in here,
Right.
but Subversion doesn't know that, and
Right,
it'll
you
get...
can't tell.
So because of that, we said that kind of thing is not in our file format, and anytime you have a collection of entities, it works backwards where the entity knows who it's in,
Right.
and then
The relational
does that
database
hookup
style,
at startup
basically.
time,
Yeah.
which is a little bit of overhead, but it's small, right?
Got it.
And that's just to illustrate this is not an isolated file format issue at all, right? It's like a list of the things that I connect with is a totally reasonable thing to have in a file format, and yet for our requirements, it was causing problems, and we
Right.
found a different way to do it.
So, okay, I just want to ask the original question, though, because I
Okay.
don't understand it. So I print out a floating point value.
Yeah.
I print out the hex version of a floating point value, right? And presumably the reason I'm doing this is because the printout routine for the floating point value and the scan routine that loads the floating point value back in
Is not guaranteed to be
nobody
reversible.
did the work to make those reversible.
People have since then.
Right. I mean,
But
nobody
we didn't
nobody
adopt
in
that.
this the C runtime library that I'm calling. Let's say I didn't write it
Sure.
myself. It's just I'm calling this function, and I know that it won't be reversible.
Yeah.
So now I go to load the file in, and I load the file in, and I see that the two numbers are not the same. How do I know whether the reason that they're not the same is because the user edited it, or that the reason that they're not the same?
Because when the user, I mean, give me if I'm wrong here, but when the user edits the floating point value, you delete the hex value.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay, so
yeah.
that
Or
doesn't.
Yeah.
we might have also measured the magnitude of the difference as well. Like if it's a
So-
significant difference, you could
do it.
just as a way to like, okay, maybe they forgot to delete that part or whatever. But I think we just delete the value.
So basically, the user goes into the text file.
Yeah.
They change the floating point value.
Yeah.
They need to remember, get rid of the hex float, because otherwise we're just going to overwrite your floating point value next time you save this thing.
Yeah.
Would that be a quick sort of?
And this is interesting too, because what we're saying right now only applies to the entity files,
Right.
which are rarely edited
By hand,
anyway. And those get saved out all the time when you
Right.
save stuff in the editor. For stuff like the variables that I was talking about
Right.
before, the computer doesn't ever write, we ended up writing some
Right.
later, I guess, but the main ones
Right.
are read-only, and so
So
we
you
don't
don't care
do that.
about this, right? Okay.
Right, and so we don't have that potential mistake of forgetting to delete the hex float as well.
All right.
But it's hard to, because you put it, it's like one space away from the number, so you see it, it's
Right.
like
You're probably
there.
going to remember unless
Yeah.
you're just totally spaced.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't know why I really wanted to know the answer. to that
Some
question.
things are critical.
I'm just like, wait. I kind of wanted to ask a little bit about that reverse storage part there, because I think that's kind of an interesting thing just in general, which is that any time that you're storing information, you obviously have a choice. If it's information that involves sort of a variable length list or something like this, you can either store something like a list in the actual data format, meaning I can say, okay, this is going to be a variably sized thing in here that just enumerates all the things that are members of it or whatever. Or you can do what you were talking about there, which is you can transform that into saying everyone has a sort of back pointer that says, which list am I a member of, right? And what's interesting about that is benefits of that are, like you were saying, it means that now it doesn't mess with an entity's data every time maybe that list order changes or any time like something like this happens that isn't really something that you cared about. But it does mean stuff like, okay, things can only be in one list now, right, for
Yep.
example. Or now we need to start having multiple ones of these. And the reason I bring that up is because I think that actually happens in the witness. There were these times when you had to have stuff like reference 1, reference 2, because sometimes thing would
That
happen.
was
So I
a
was just
different
curious.
case. That was more, like you've got like a marker entity type,
Okay.
right? And what it wants to do is based on some string tag, like says what it, like open a door if a person walks into this marker or whatever. And just, whenever you do that, you have different numbers of things that any of those handlers will care
So
about.
it's
So
parameters
those
to
were
the
just
handler.
slots for that.
Okay, so-
We never ran into the specific problem of, oh my God, we can't, we sort of wanted to put things in more than one group, but it was never such a burning desire that it became a problem. And we could have just said like group 2 or whatever, right?
Okay.
So, but in a different game, that might be more
More
of
of a
a
thing.
problem. Yeah, but it's like I'm saying, it's contextual. You solve the problem that you have as opposed to everybody's problem.
Everybody's problem.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here. We are down. We're actually making reasonable progress here. This one comes from, and I think this was basically someone who submitted a question because they wanted to finally give me names that I would have no trouble pronouncing. Mike from Amsterdam asks, if you could go back in time and give yourself only one piece of advice at the beginning of your career, what would it be? Deep thoughts.
I think I've got one. If anybody ever tells you anything that's related to finance or legal, you should get a lawyer to review it. You should get a lawyer to review it.
That is not what I was expecting, but
Honestly, though, that's all I'm thinking of is like, yeah, maybe spend the money on lawyers. Maybe don't be afraid of them, you know?
so two.
I think I would have told myself to be a lawyer.
All right, so 50% of the panel says talk to a lawyer is the advice they would have given themselves at the beginning of their programming career. Good advice, probably. John or Ron want to either say make it 75% of the panel or do a different one?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time with that one if you restrict it to programming, right? If it has to be a programming piece of advice, you know, that I would give it myself. I mean, I don't know that I can really think of one, actually.
How about non-programming then?
I think the thing that, I mean, you hear this a lot, that I probably struggled with a little bit early is don't be afraid to fail.
All right.
You know, just try stuff no matter what, and if it doesn't work, just keep trying. You know, I think very early on in my career, I was a little bit, you know, dejected by failures, where now I don't care at some level.
Is that the sort of thing that basically, like, you know, seeing this maybe kind of relates back to the imposter syndrome part of things that we were talking about earlier? Is it's the sort of thing that kind of is like, well, if you experience failure and then have some successes, then you can sort of start to put it in context where it's like, oh, failures are just things that happen on the way to success. But maybe it's like you haven't had a success yet, so all you're sort of seeing is the failures? Or is this something that's more like, no, I had successes already at that point. I just, for some reason, was still afraid of failure as a reason to not go do something or try something?
Well, I think a lot of it, and maybe it does go back to that, you know, imposter syndrome thing. It's watching people I have an immense amount of respect for fail.
Okay.
And it's one of the reasons I enjoy watching your Twitch feed, right? Because
there's a lot of failure.
Because I mean, you are one of, you know, the best programmers that I know, and I watch you on that feed struggle with stuff, and I go, oh well, if Casey is struggling with this stuff, it's okay for me to struggle with this stuff too. And
One of the best programmers you know before you started watching the Twitch.
But I think that's the kind of thing that, you know, over time you realize, oh, it's not me, it's not just me that's failing, everybody's failing, and it makes it okay.
That does seem to me to be like a pretty big part of it too, because I feel like I don't even know if I still internalize that part of it, meaning I think I still generally think that I, like, even though if I cognitively think of it, I don't think of it this way, but when I'm just subconsciously thinking about it, I don't think of other programmers that I respect as making mistakes. It just isn't in there. It's like when I think of somebody else doing this program, I just don't think of them making the mistakes. Now, I know they must make them. It's not that if you asked me to then think about it, would I not? But I think it is kind of the case that it's hard to actually remind yourself in practice, no, really, they're all making mistakes. That's just how it works. John?
I'm going to start with a design one, because that's the problem I actually had, but then it's got a programming equivalent, right? Which is just, you know, usually you have a voice somewhere telling you what the problem is with what you're doing, and you usually choose to ignore it. So the first professional game I did was a science fiction hover tank war game, and it had some
Much like
gameplay problems. Yes. It had some gameplay problems that made it, you know, not that fun. Like the combat situations would always devolve into like a mess in a small area of the map, and it was because of decisions that, from a high level, I had decided were important. Like, oh, you could place a unit anywhere because that gives you the maximum player freedom or whatever. But what that really does is it makes terrain a lot less important or whatever, right? But I had lots of reasons in my head why it was a good game. And it was pretty good in some areas, but it had some fatal flaws to it, right? And I knew what they were, right? But I cognitive dissonance myself out of understanding them and acting on them.
Just because you
Right.
didn't want that to be true, so you just
Yeah.
ignored the fact that you kind of knew.
Or, there's always enough things to think about and deal with, especially when it's your own software company, that you just find other things.
To do.
It's like, oh, this doesn't feel the way I want, but, we'll figure it out eventually. It's not gonna be these decisions that I made that were the problem.
Okay,
We'll just
okay.
deal with it later, right? And the programming version of that is just, you're building some system that you think is gonna solve a problem and gonna be really great, and it's got plenty of drawbacks and downsides, and you probably know, some of them you probably don't know because you haven't hit the wall, but some of them you really do, right?
Yeah.
But you're just choosing not to pay attention to that voice in your head, so it's just like listen to that and pay attention to that. I learned that probably in programming before I learned it in design, but I didn't know that either at the beginning, right? Yeah.
I would say kind of similar or along those same lines, one of the pieces of advice that I will simply throw in here that's actually from Jeff Roberts, who was in the opening session of this HandmadeCon. One of the things that he said that I found to be totally true is he said that actually finish pieces of code before moving on to new pieces of code, which is an odd thing to say because it sounds like, well, obviously that has to be true. But actually, when you're doing a fairly large project or you're at the point, in your programming career where you're doing, a broad spectrum of things, it's often the case that you'll get something up to just the point where it sort of works a little bit, and then you'll move on to a new thing, right? And one of the things that happens, at least to me there, is if I don't actually stop and go, wait, have I actually done all of the programming necessary to finish sort of fleshing this out completely? And it doesn't mean I have to optimize it all the way down, or it doesn't mean I have to have it in its shippable state. It's just, have I actually finished it to the point where I don't think I will have to come back to this for some ancillary reason? I find that a lot of times I just won't do that if I don't stop and hear Jeff's voice in my head saying this, right? Because a lot of times you just kind of want to get everything working, and now this thing just kind of works. And okay, I'm aware of these things that it's not doing at all, but I'll do those eventually or something, right? And the reason that I find that it actually becomes important to do that is just that the amount of mental context that you build up when you're working on a piece of code doesn't come back immediately. At least it doesn't for me, if that code is at all complicated. So when I'm actually writing it for the first time, or even whenever I'm opening up a piece of code and working on this system or something, my brain is just a lot sharper at working on that system after I've been doing that for several days than if I pop back to it and now it's day one again of working on that system. And so I find that actually if I don't follow that advice, I burn a lot of time in re-getting all of my context back if the changes that I have to make are at all non-trivial. So nowadays, much more than I used to, I definitely try to kind of finish this code to the point where I don't think I need the mental context anymore. And if it's just stuff that I can just go, look, if I pop back in here, it's brutally obvious what I've been doing. I need to optimize this loop. There's no conceptual optimizations. It's just some assembly language stuff, or put SIMDIze it or something like this. That's no problem, right? But if it's not that, if it's something where it's no, there's conceptual optimizations that I probably need to make in order to make this thing run, I now do them there if I know that I have to do them, because otherwise I find I just burn all this time on it otherwise. That might not be what other people find, but just the way I program it, it seems like it really is true. That it ends up saving time in the end. So I'd throw that out there. For Jeff.
I have one thing to add on there, actually, since nobody else jumped in. There's a secondary reason to do that relates to a topic we had earlier, which is just, we all make stuff and we feel like it's crappy a lot of the time, right? And a lot of the reason we feel like it's crappy is because we took all these shortcuts to get it going. I mean, and that's my programming philosophy, right? Is get it running as quickly as possible. Yeah. So I will very deliberately take a large number of shortcuts where you could it looks like a wall, but you could kick through it because it's paper, right? Yeah. And that you have to come back and do that later. And at some point, that affects your picture of what you're making, right? Because in the beginning, it's I'm going to make an amazing thing that's going to do all this, right? And then after a while, it's oh, I've been making this crappy thing of all these shortcuts that don't really do, and they pile up, and eventually, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, your morale changes. Oh, this thing I'm working on is not that good, right? And then combined with all the factors we were talking about before about how it just can be so hard to just keep going, right? That this becomes a barrier, at least for me. And so, for example, with the compiler, I've taken a great deal of joy in just like stopping and like, you know what? Okay, cool. I've done a lot of good work, gotten to this point. I'm going to go back now and, you know, refine these couple of areas to a much greater degree than I need to.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just going to do I'm going to go chase all the corners of this,
Yeah.
and I'm going to be really proud of what I did. And
Right,
sometimes I
yes.
use the demos to do that. Like, okay, I'm going to demo in a week. Everything I do from now till then, I can already demo, right?
Right, right.
But I'm just going to harden all that stuff.
Right, right.
And at the end of that, I feel really good about what I did.
Yes.
Because it's quality now.
Yes.
It's not, you know, it's not just a thing that's going to collapse as soon as I
Yeah.
turn that way.
Yeah.
So, and then that helps me keep going.
Yeah.
So I should have said that earlier. But
Well, but it's an interesting sort of trade-off too, because it's like overdoing things is definitely a problem in programming as well. So you're constantly in the state
Yeah.
of like, am I overbuilding a system? And so I think it's important to eventually learn that there's a difference between adding stuff to a system and making the system good. Like they're totally unrelated, right? It's like adding features or thinking that it's going to do more or do whatever is a separate part, and that's the thing you want to kind of limit. Like only do the things you actually need to do. But then the like quality part is like a separate axis, and you kind of do want to go down that one
Yeah.
more than oftentimes I think you might by default.
but we have different styles too, right?
Okay.
So like if I were doing Handmade Hero,
Right.
I would not do the investment.
By the way, I
in-
don't do this on Handmade Hero at
Yeah.
all because I can't.
But even like
so.
between what we do, like
Yes,
you went and did like I'm building the technical infrastructure for the
Yes.
game because I want to build a quality game, or because that's what you want to
Well, it's
show.
because I
or
don't know
something.
game design, actually. It's a
Well,
real reason. Yeah.
Like what I would do in that case is I would have gone and just done the lowest effort things possible to get things on the screen and then elaborated them, right? So those are two different approaches, and I'm not.
I think that is kind of what we did, though, wasn't it?
I don't know. I don't feel that way. I see what you work on, and I'm like, I would have done that later, right?
Okay.
But it's not to say that one is better than the other, or like it's even it's down to your personality as a programmer. You have to do the best thing for you. But what's the best thing for you also changes with time and when in the project it is. So like the stop and work hard and make a piece of it high quality is almost the exact opposite advice of like don't rat hole on
Right.
things. But both of those are correct advice at different times in different contexts. And part of being a really good programmer is knowing when to swap in one piece of advice for another, or you do a blend of like 30% this advice and
Yes,
70% this advice, right?
Advice mix.
And that's why new people can get really confused.
I
right?
still get confused. I mean, I still don't feel like it's the kind of thing that I'll probably ever not mess up, or at least not know if I'm messing up, right? Like, maybe this system shouldn't have been done this way or at this time or whatever. So I don't know necessarily if it ever gets perfected in terms of allowing your experience to inform those things. But, unless you're literally working on something that you totally have done before and just know this is exactly the order to do it in or something like that.
One other thing that's funny is this also happens in design, where like I have a lot of ideas about what's a good game design for me or for a particular game, right? But then there's other ideas that come into play at different contexts and different times. So like someone on the team will be asking me how something should be, and I'll be like, most of the time I'll say this one thing, and then one day I'll like say a completely opposite thing because now the situation is like
It's changed,
flipped.
yeah.
And I feel, like there's this stereotype of like the flaky designer who just
Yeah,
says
yeah.
random crap that
Right,
like
right.
nobody, prima donna just like
Yeah.
has ideas out of nowhere and
Yeah.
expects you to do them. But it's actually, if they're a good designer, there's actually something very similar at play where you cross some invisible boundary where before one thing was appropriate and now a different thing is appropriate. And we don't know exactly when that was crossed, but it has happened.
And you can just tell.
And now what we're doing is different in this one piece, right? And so,
Well, I don't
I'm gonna shut up
understand
now.
the punctuation.
yeah. Well,
Was the end of all, like it made sense right up to the eh.
it's just, if someone asks you how do you design a game, you have to actually plug them into the matrix and do the thing where Neo like shakes for a while. because it's not that simple to say how to do it.
Right.
Because you have to give them the BSP tree of all these weird lines where you cross this one and now this other thing, and it's a multi-dimensional space and whatever.
Right.
And mine doesn't agree with anyone else's model anyway.
Okay. So you're basically just saying like, yeah, okay, I've got this complex set of internal sort of trade-offs. I can move as the design moves around, the actual practical thing I'm going to tell somebody needs to get done in the game is going to change. Sometimes I just cross some boundary where it's like, okay, this thing I told you and was very serious about yesterday needing to be in this game totally doesn't need to be in this game. This other thing does now. I realize that sounds nuts, but trust me, there is a very sane, logical process that occurred internally that I just can't describe.
And I don't do that too often, but I have done it. Right.
Okay.
I have
Step
done it.
one, write a John Blow simulator.
Yeah.
Run your problem through it.
So then the last thing to make that make more sense is like the technical version of that does exist, right? And so in the large, like the Chris Butcher asset system thing was like the technical version of that, but played out at a much longer time scale where you could see the reason, right? Like, oh, we were doing this thing, but had these drawbacks that we didn't anticipate, and because of that reason, the right decision is now different, right?
Yes.
So it's the same thing, it's just a lot harder to see because it's subjective.
Right, with game design being something that you can't say is absolutely right or wrong. You have you
but
can't
then,
be
like,
why are there 15 megatasks is not a question you can ask about game design.
But then, as it becomes more subjective in the technical realm too, like how should the handmade hero engine be?
Right.
Well, there's a lot of things, and you might change your mind tomorrow about something.
Right. Okay, so I don't know how we're doing on time here. We have 15 minutes left, I think.
I'm going to not talk for the rest of the 15 minutes.
That's it? Okay, you're not. All right, so these questions cannot be directed at John in any way. This one's for Pat. It said, regarding the prevention of cheating, how much is it, I figured we were a little heavy there in our sort of psychology for a second there, so this is totally concrete. Regarding the prevention of cheating, how much of a difference does encrypting gameplay network traffic realistically make? I often hear it is important, but it seems to me it would only catch the lowest hanging fruit.
So first I'd say that the thing you're doing for encryption is you're actually preventing people's personal data from being stolen if they're playing in a net cafe as their primary motivation for encrypting. If you want to cheat in games, there's lots of ways to do it. So, I mean, first I'm going to separate like console games from PC games. So console games, it's much harder to cheat because it's hard to inject code into the console. I mean, some really smart people have managed to figure out exploits for Xbox and PlayStation, but by and large really tough. And then the risk is if you do that and get caught, then your Xbox gets bricked and you can't play anymore and your account's wiped out. So encryption, it can be useful for console games. But for PC games, it's actually not really good anti-cheat mechanism because what happens is the game client is already running in an untrustworthy environment, and all I need to do is break open my create remote thread, inject some code into the process space, and like discover where the network code is and start sending messages on, as if I was the game client. So encryption doesn't save you at all. So I would say that you should do it, but it's for a different reason.
So basically, encryption is for keeping the stuff that the user knows themselves from being snooped in route, but other than that, it does nothing relating to cheating at all, basically.
That's right.
Okay. So here is a question for everybody, I guess except John, because he has opted out of any further vocal.
I hope it's a question about the witness.
Oh. Did you want to ask one? I could ask one. So this question is, when debugging your code, are there obvious shortcomings in the debuggers you use? And are there any... You sure you don't want to talk for the rest of the session? Are there any obvious things that debuggers should do to make debugging easier? This is a question that is apparently... Everyone thinks immediately tons of people will have tons of answers for it based on the laughter. So I apologize out there to people who write debuggers.
Yeah, there's an answer. So Watcom 10.0 back in the DOS 4GW days actually was really powerful. And you could run like a short script so that like breakpoint A would hit and it would run a script and look at some stuff and then set breakpoint B. So you could catch like these really esoteric bugs that only happen in certain states. And I'm still waiting for Visual Studio to do something to make that process easy.
Yeah, I don't think they have any way to script a breakpoint, do they? Or have scripts that...
Yeah, you can write code to do that, like sort of aftermarket and set debug registers and things, but it's like you're going to write a lot of your own code to do that.
Okay.
I have this bug that I'm currently trying to track down. I know there are ways around this, but it's a bug that only happens when the game is running in full screen mode.
Okay.
And that becomes very difficult to debug because I can't actually step through my code. I can't look at stuff because we're in full screen mode. And the bug only happens in full screen mode.
So you don't use a secondary monitor?
I do not, no.
Are you cafe only programming or something? This is like, I'm not going to cart my monitor in.
No,
for my
EGA
Mac.
monitors, you can't dual monitor them.
So literally some way to just overlay the text on the screen would solve this problem.
Yeah.
I feel like for laptop work that would make a lot of sense in general because
and
even
it's
people
hard
with secondary
when
monitors don't have
when
it.
you're working on a laptop and you're doing stuff, it's very difficult to debug in full screen mode.
So I guess I'll say Tommy, not John here because he can't talk.
Mine's very quick, and it might be a thing, but I haven't really looked into it too much. You know data breakpoints? How
Yeah.
come in the watch window I can't right-click and hit watch the data right there? Why can't I do that? Why do I have to copy it and then paste it and then kill all the stuff that's also in the watch row to make the data breakpoint? It's so irritating.
Well, you gotta.
Like, why isn't that a thing?
This is your job. You have to get paid to do something.
Just
you gotta
right-click.
move it from the thing to the other
I use
thing.
like 4 things in Visual Studio, and that's the one thing I want. Yeah.
Well, it's going backwards. I mean, you used to at least be able to drag a breakpoint from line to line. You can't even do that anymore.
Yeah, no.
So
No.
don't expect new functionality.
No, I copy and paste. It's fine.
We could re-request old functionality. No?
I'm done.
Fair
I'm
enough.
done.
Let me see what we've got here. We still got a little more time. So this one I think is possibly a little tough because I'm not sure, I guess I know Tommy has done this, but I'm not sure how many other people have, even though it's addressed to everyone. And the question is, what are the costs and benefits of shipping a mod API or level editor with a game? I guess, well, you know what? Actually, no, Warcraft et al. Were doing that.
Yeah, Warcraft 2 and
as well.
StarCraft had level editors.
Yeah. Okay. So,
I don't know, like, people make these trivial little add-ons like Dota, stuff like that.
I'm sorry, which add-on? So, did you want to say the cost benefit of that, I guess?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because, clearly other companies have benefited hugely, right? Like Valve and Riot Games have made big hay on making new versions of that game. But also Warcraft 3 probably got a lot of users that were playing extensively for really long periods of time because of the extended play value of the game, because people were coming up with new ideas all the time. And certainly, Valve has made a really successful game business out of taking the mods that people have created and re-releasing them, which is kind of funny because back in, I don't know, maybe 2002 or something like that, there was a bunch of us playing CS, Counter-Strike Beta, and we're like, no, everybody who wants to play this game has probably already downloaded it. Nobody's ever going to pay money to Valve to release this game. And, I turned out to be totally wrong on that one. So I think there's huge value in doing level editors if you have the time in your development schedule.
I guess one thing I would ask about that is that really level editor, or does that have to go all the way to mod? Because I'm just thinking about the things, because it sort of said mod or level editor, and they're kind of grouped together there. But I'm just thinking, in terms of finer detail, it seems like a lot of that value that you're talking about, like for example, that Valve gets out of the pulling mods into their sort of business model or whatever, or the Warcraft spawning sort of these other lineages. Those seem to be mostly if you can actually change what the game is, right? Which is not really quite the same as level editor. So I wonder, is perhaps there a big difference between the value in doing full mod support versus just level editor? And maybe level editor isn't so useful, but mod support definitely is? Or you know what I'm saying? I wonder if there's actually a pretty big difference between going all the way and only going part of the way in terms of allowing the game to sort of be customized in that way.
Yeah, well, and as much as Warcraft 2 didn't really spawn any derivative games
Yeah.
because it was a level editor.
Yeah.
And Warcraft 3 did because it was
Yeah.
a full mod capability
Yeah.
system. Like, I guess you could argue that mods are a better strategy.
Tommy, do you have anything with, because Super Meat Boy on the PC shipped with level editing?
Yeah,
If I'm
well, it
not
didn't ship
mistaken.
with it, but, which is the mistake, is don't promise stuff after, because you're not gonna wanna do it, so.
Okay.
But I think more than, are mods more valuable than level editors based on the context of the game.
Okay.
So with Meat Boy, when I did the editor and I put the editor out there, people made 7,400 levels.
Yeah.
And that just had people just constantly playing the game,
Okay.
which, just had constant attention. There were weekly levels that people were making, and I can't say if I actually made any money off of that, but what it did is it did get a whole bunch of people excited about creating for the game. So I think in that way for Meat Boy, it works as just a level editor. I don't think I needed to go deeper into mods, like make it so Meat Boy has a gun and you can make an entire different game. I don't think it would have really added much to the game because, with Meat Boy, a lot of what made it great is the stuff that you couldn't do. So, you couldn't make weird little slopey levels that, have all these rolling hills and stuff because it was just tiles. And what people did is they took that and they creatively found ways to make new kinds of levels and stuff. And I think in that way that, that added some sort of something that engaged people to the game. So mod or no, just kind of context.
So, I guess question about that. It did say costs and benefits kind of thing. Obviously, benefit to doesn't have to be monetary, right? In a sense, it could be just like, I wanted to have those extra people make those maps. That's something I wanted in the, as my vision for what this is. So the benefit doesn't necessarily have to be money. It could be anything, I suppose.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the cost part, because that's something that people haven't really talked about yet in the answers. It's just that, okay, so let's say we do have this benefit that we want or that we're thinking of. What about the cost part of shipping that, right? Because you kind of touched on it a little bit there. It's like I promised it, and now I have to deliver it. So it's a big undertaking potentially, or kind of. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Just depending on what it was. Like the reason it was a big undertaking for Meat Boy wasn't in technical complexity or anything.
Right.
It was literally, I don't want to work on this anymore,
Okay.
and now I have to make it look pretty, and I have to fix all the bugs in it that Ed he didn't place it there. He didn't place that there, but now I have to make it so people can place this thing here and it doesn't crash. So,
Right.
and after the crazy development cycle, it was like, well, I kind of want to live life now. I don't want to keep working on this stupid thing. So, I think though, having said that, the games that I'm working on now that I want to put out, I do want to put out the level editor at launch because if for no other reason, I enjoyed seeing everything that everybody made. I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
And I think it helps with just a community in general because, media is kind of garbage, Twitter's kind of garbage. You want people to just play and be excited about your game, and the way they can do that, some of them at least, is by making more of it.
So this would get to a question that was asked during the break, actually, because it kind of touched on it there just incidentally. The question was actually about something that John had said earlier, which means you may have to talk briefly. I'm talking about just a little, maybe yes or no, or you could kind of blink it out. You know what I mean? John had said something earlier that was about okay, I had done something in particular, and I was really burnt out from this, and for doing things a certain way for too long or whatever and get really burnt out. And he had used kind of the example of I was at 20% and then went, et cetera. And the person asked a very interesting question, which was, how do you know what that even means in your head? Ignore trying to quantify it to 20%, because obviously, you can't be that precise or anything. But how do you know what it is to be, I'm at my normal productivity, or I'm really close to bottom productivity, or how do you, what does that even mean? Is that just an experience thing, or is that something that almost looked like you were going to say something?
think it's probably the number of times per hour that I open up Twitter.
That's
Right.
it.
Yeah,
So we could quantify it.
You could
exactly.
Totally quantify my productivity.
yeah, like
Okay.
3 times an hour. That's a good day.
Yeah, that's a good day, right.
Yeah.
All right, so number of Twitter checks per hour is a good metric.
Yeah.
What is a number that would be good productivity then? How
Well-
often would you check Twitter, for example?
Well, I mean, literally with Twitter, right? I have 2-factor authentication turned on, and so in the morning, I will log out of Twitter.
Okay.
Because it is such a pain to log back into Twitter, because I have to get my cell phone out and enter some crazy number and all this other stuff. That's kind of how I keep myself productive during the day, is
Awesome.
to lock myself out of Twitter. I know this
nice.
does not relate to your question.
It really does, actually. So basically what you're saying is 2-factor authentication is not a security thing, it's a productivity
It's a
thing.
productivity thing.
I guess though, if you were totally,
if you follow me on Twitter and you don't hear from me during the day, I'm getting a lot
Not
of
a
work
work
done.
day.
and
So
like, the same way, if you're not feeling it, you're not going to log out of Twitter so you can be logged into it and continue to be on Twitter. So if you're not feeling very productive, like that morning when you're logging out of Twitter, you just be like, I'll just stay in or something.
just leave it on. You never know
I'm
what
not
I'm
feeling it. Yeah.
So would you even go so far as to say that we could get productivity gains by moving to 3-factor authentication? As a society.
Possibly, yes.
Okay. All right. Pat?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's email, right? Because it's like, ooh, there's fun stuff. I can go and respond to people. I actually turn off email toast when I'm programming, so
Okay.
that it doesn't pop up and it's like, oh, a distraction. Oh, that looks cool.
Yeah. And so in general, you would know if you were kind of burned out, if you're just kind of like spending all your time in email or that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
or alternately, if I don't really have any idea what to do what I'm doing, let me hit Google again and again. Surely somebody has solved this problem before.
Okay, all right.
Hey,
So,
can I just copy paste something, please?
so basically searching for other people's answers rather than writing the answer yourself is
That's
a good
right.
sign that like you're not that, well, and I suppose too, because it's like, that means you're not that excited about solving it yourself because you just want it to kind of be done and move on.
Exactly.
How are we doing on timer? We got 3 minutes left. All right. So here is kind of, I guess we'll do this on the closing question because I think it's the only one that I can ask that would in no way require John to talk. The question is, what old school books did you like back when people still read books about programming? Or tech things in general. And I guess we'll just go down. I don't know if you've got any. Ron?
Well, I mean, I think my favorite tech book ever was just that big, fat Commodore 64 manual that showed all the cool peek and poke locations and stuff. I thrived on that book.
Does this come with the?
No, you had
No,
to
you
order
bought
it separately.
Okay.
It didn't come with it. You ordered it separately, and it talked about every aspect of the machine and where all the memory values were and stuff. And I don't really read a lot of stuff. I mean, even before the internet, I didn't. It was mostly just conversations with people. But that one book, I just
particular.
completely devoured. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a good book and a not good book. So the good book was actually an AI programming book that I got when I was in college, and it sort of demystified the whole idea of how AIs are programmed. Like, started with the basics of depth first and breadth first searches and things, and because before then it's like, I don't know, you make the computer think. I don't know. And it was really valuable to sort of demystify the whole process because I was still learning coding then. And the one that actually was the reverse of that was the KNRC book, Koenig and Ritchie, because it's like, jumps into like printf and pointers and stuff. It's like, this isn't really helpful. How do I do useful stuff without pointers, right? Because, coming from like a very beginning Pascal knowledge, it's like, there's all this weirdness in the language. I don't know. And you just want to do something interesting first. So I didn't find it to be a very helpful book.
So the K&R C book was just like, it was too focused on just like specific languagey things they were dealing with and didn't really take the time to go like, look, here's sort of how you start doing things in C, and then we'll kind of unpack that later.
Yeah.
Interesting. Tommy?
I didn't really read many programming books. I had my one QBasic book, but that was it. So
What was QBasic on?
it was on the Panasonic computer I had that was a laptop that was about 35 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really cool. It had like a green screen and a built-in printer
Right,
and two things, and it had a keyboard that went over it, and you would carry it in. Well,
Yes.
you wouldn't carry it. It had a roll case because it was too heavy. Yeah, that was like my first computer, and it had a QBasic book, and that was kind of the only one I read. So.
John, can you just say the book title? You don't have to say anything else. No. Can you write it down on a piece of paper in a way that we could like hold
No,
up?
I don't have one.
Okay.
The way I got into programming, there was some books that came like at Radio Shack for the TRS-80 color computer. I just remember there were 2 books that like started with really simple exercises, and you would go through. I don't know if they were particularly good. It was just like how I did it. So, and you wouldn't use those to learn today. So.
No.
Yeah. Well, maybe if you wanted to learn how to program the TRS-80. All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So thanks so much for coming back and talking with us again this year. It's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.